Hello everybody, I hope you are all well. In the wake of some illuminating conversations which I've had over the past couple of months with Papa Joint, and in particular his most recent video discussing ableism in the scene holistically, which I would encourage everybody to watch and is available on his Instagram page, I would like to clarify some things, specifically on the topic of ableism. My focus point in this video will be ableism, but I will touch on other issues throughout. It's no secret that the last couple of months have been very difficult, not just for myself, but for the wider Scottish drag community. While I understand, accept and completely empathise with much of the outpouring of anger as frustrations reached a boiling point, one of the things I found the most emotionally complicated to navigate is the consistent misinformation and misrepresentation of the truth. I am a firm believer in the value of the truth, as the truth is the basis for all authentic connection, conversation, and in particular, accountability. And so I feel it's very important for me, particularly for my own mental health, to reaffirm reality. My intention for posting this is, as I said, to provide some clarity and to be able to move on from this specific issue. I completely respect however any other disabled person chooses to interact with me or this video, but I do ask for the decency of human understanding and compassion from non-disabled allies. I anticipate this video will be quite long, but ultimately, I believe it's best to be thorough and leave no stone unturned. I am reading from a script which I have pre-written, and I will also be posting that script online, both for accessibility reasons and in case anybody wishes to examine my words in more depth on their own. Since June, I have been called an ableist bigot incessantly as a result of a screenshot which was exposed from a group chat called Mama Rue's Angels, in which I said, "Fuck disabled people coming for my brand," or something to that effect. This comment, which is at the expense of myself, mind you, has been twisted out of context maliciously and presented as though it was some sort of pitchfork-raised cartoon villain hatred of the disabled, which could not be further from the truth. While the drag scene decided en masse to choose to ignore any possible context or nuance, not just in regards to myself, but historically when other performers have been called out prior, which in truth I do find to be incredibly suspect when dealing with conversations which originate from a setting with an expectation of privacy and trust, I have decided that I am going to finally clear this up following the conversation that I had with Papa myself and my counsellor. Firstly, this comment was made in May 2023 when Rujazzle was in Gran Canaria. This is a screenshot of several different conversations happening at one time, which have all been taken out of context. My comment referenced a running gag about myself, which has been an ongoing personal joke between me, my ex-partner, and all of my close friends since 2018. At the time of this comment, I was in a long-term relationship with an autistic ex-partner. I understand now that this ex-partner has involved themselves with the ongoing conversation, especially as it pertains to allegations of foundational ableism, as I was accused of responsibility of that by numerous people. And he has named numerous other performers with historic ableist conduct, such as punching down at the use of mobility aids or those who are non-verbal in their acts, which they were either paid to do on stage or rewarded with challenge wins for doing so, long before I had ever performed in drag. Drag was a sticking point between the two of us to the extent that it is ultimately what killed our relationship. I hope the perspective of an openly autistic audience member who was pushed out of the drag scene by how aggressively they were forced to mask by the hostility, falseness and subterfuge of such a toxic environment may be of some use to allistic allies, and I will be returning to this point later. Anyway, this ex-partner and I had a running joke with each other, as most couples do, which began after I had pushed him towards therapy and later an adult autism diagnosis in 2018. After he was diagnosed, he would tell me that I was the autism whisperer due to my uncanny ability to communicate with and understand the autistic experience, and how often I seemed orbited by or drawn to autistic people. These are all his words. In retrospect, this is clear proof of my own neurodivergence, but at the time, this was his assertions about me. When we chose to open our relationship in 2020, I continually found myself in dynamic after dynamic with different men, almost all of whom were either openly or later revealed themselves to be either autistic or otherwise neurodivergent. If you are aware of my dalliances with other drag queens, then this will also be generally known to you as well. Obviously, we would share our extracurricular experiences with each other, and after a while, my ex-partner began the running joke of the fact that I had an autism fetish, which he began to rib me for. If I was to show him the social media of whoever I was speaking to, or if he was to meet them in person, he would consistently react with, "Very your type, Andrew, he's definitely autistic." And he would laugh at my ability to always, somehow, pick out the neurodivergent person in the crowd to be attracted to. Over time, this joke began to extend beyond just our relationship and also included our close, mutual, personal friends, such as our university course mates and ultimately those who were in the Mama Rue's Angels group chat, who had a greater deal of insight into us and our relationship. By 2023, this joke was also very publicly known to others in the spaces which I operated in frequently, such as the gay bars in Glasgow. In the way that Twitter has a white boy of the month, Skinny was known to have her autistic boy of the month. Personally, I found this joke hysterical because it was accurate. It was uncanny how often, over the years, I would find myself repeatedly in some dalliance, even if it was just with a random man in the club who had made advances towards me, only to once again discover that they were autistic or otherwise neurodivergent. In time, it became so consistent that my friends and I would privately assert that if I was attracted to you, then you were more than likely neurodivergent. This is common in autistic or neurodivergent culture, that we seek each other out subliminally due to our ability to connect on a deeper level than we traditionally can with neurotypical people. Additionally, if you are surrounded by autistic people, then you are more than likely autistic yourself, something which I have recently discovered for myself. For clarity, as I am no stranger to my words being twisted, I do not actually have an autism fetish. I am autistic myself, and I suppose in the spirit of honesty, I find some typically autistic traits attractive, such as intense passion, or info dumping as a communication style, the ability to gauge with parallel play as intimacy, blunt honesty as it always allows me to know exactly where I stand, and especially I have always been inspired by those who march to the beat of their own drum. I do not think it's problematic in any way to find those traits attractive, and I would say I'm also drawn to these traits beyond romantic or sexual attraction, as I also gravitate towards those friends and friendship, which is easily observed. I'd also like to say that it's currently extremely common and socially acceptable to post about wanting an autistic boyfriend or to suggest that autistic men are attractive for being autistic, which I assume is a large part of why absolutely nobody had ever expressed any issue with this running bit before June 2024, as I don't feel it's generally socially unacceptable to say. Frankly, in my opinion, the way in which an autistic person, or indeed two autistic people, define and discuss their relationship with each other or to autism should not be up for public debate or dissection, especially by allistic people. Again, this joke originated about me in the wake of an autistic person's diagnosis about their observations of my relationship to them and to their autism. So to be referred to as an anti-disabled bigot as a result of its public airing has been incredibly difficult and frustrating. When I said, fuck disabled people, I meant literally have sex with, because I have been doing that since 2017. Obviously, this is not the only instance of alleged ableist conduct which was brought to light. As it pertains to other screenshots which contain the use of slurs by other people, I admit that I could have done more to disrupt or discourage that kind of language. I have always operated on the assumption that, unless extremely obvious otherwise, when slurs are being used in a queer setting without malicious purpose, they are more than likely being reclaimed or used ironically, such as jokes in Glee, South Park, or other comedies of that nature. For that matter, even when slurs are being used maliciously, for example, when I have been referred to excessively as a faggot by trans women like Lilith, or their non-binary drag child Jude in the past, I have never necessarily felt entitled to object to a member of our community for using certain offensive language, as I've always felt like the fact that we are drag artists makes it fairly obvious that there is a gap between the external language and the internal belief, and that is where the comedy comes from. Presumably, these people do not feel as though I deserve subjugation because I am a gay man. They are merely clowning on a gay man by satirically reappropriating homophobic language, which is a socially acceptable thing to do, not only in drag, but in general online. As an aside, I would actually encourage and appreciate a more thorough discussion about whether maliciously using slurs that you can reclaim to attack others is permissible or not. For example, it is generally socially acceptable within drag spaces to call a gay man contemptuously a faggot, even if you have no claim to this word whatsoever. I contrast this with the expected reaction to if, for example, I, an autistic person, was to maliciously refer to someone as the R word. I expect that that would be wholly condemned, and I'm unsure of what the difference actually is, except that it has been decided by the powers that be that faggot is not as harsh of a slur as the R word is. In the past, I had an incredibly humiliating experience when attempting to educate someone on their use of a slur, only to discover that they belonged to that group themselves and so were entitled to reclaim it. This happened in front of several people who proceeded to laugh at me and brand me the TMZ of drag and make out that I was attempting to cancel this person, and that memory has stuck with me ever since. Those who have been around since 2019 will remember that I was ascribed this label, alongside drama obsessed and a pot stirrer. And I'd like to remind you that that perception of me originated because I took offence to problematic language and jokes, and I was shamed for doing so. I will discuss this in more depth another time. This is all compounded into large influencing factors on my lack of action in checking language from others, as regardless of what some other outsiders may believe, in most social situations I am very sensitive to others' perceptions of me, and I did not want to experience that humiliation again. This extends beyond my friendship circles and is part of why I have never called out anybody for referring to me as a faggot maliciously, as I don't think any hypothetical discomfort that I ever had with that would have been respected. While I am unsure if there's any evidence of this exposed, I will happily admit that I have used the R word, as I understood that from my relationship and years of involvement with online activism spaces between 2013 and 2019 to be permissible for autistic people to reclaim, and I have been called that before. I would never use this word outside of a private environment because I understand that my personal level of comfortability with it does not extend to every other neurodivergent or otherwise disabled person. Ultimately, I am still an adult, and it is my responsibility to manage my behaviour when dealing with these complicated social dynamics. As a result of complex trauma, I have become a very emotionally numb person. Graphic imagery or language do not generally distress me anymore, and it was easy for me to gloss over a lot of this language in a way that I understand others cannot. And I do regret choosing to embrace dark humour as a salve as wholeheartedly as I have. I do also accept responsibility for my part in cultivating an environment where language of this nature was used as flippantly as it was. I understand many younger drag artists may have looked up to and respected me. From my perspective, that dark humour always came from a place of disempowering it through satire and irony, rather than reinforcing it. But I am acutely aware of the fact that intent does not negate impact, and after all, without context, a slur is just a slur. I have reflected on this specific aspect of things quite a great deal in the last few months. Because is this language still wrong if everyone around consents to its usage and nobody around is being hurt by it? I'd argue that yes, it is still wrong, because if a tree falls over in the woods, it still makes noise even if there's not an audience to hear it. What I think is interesting to unpack is how that viewpoint could be reached without drawing from a consequentialist argument. Consequentialism is the moral theory that an action is right or wrong based on its consequences only. It has been a regularly affirmed position that intent does not negate impact, and that feelings were hurt, which are both consequentialist arguments, essentially saying that someone's lack of negative intent doesn't offset negative consequences. However, this argument does not function in a circumstance that did not have consequences, and where feelings were not hurt. The action which directly resulted in the hurt was the exposing of the language, which I imagine the scene would argue was a good thing, despite any malicious intent in the agents who did so. As such, a consequentialist argument cannot be retroactively applied to explain why that language was wrong to use at the time, and so another argument must exist. Please do not misunderstand me. My argument is not by any means that this language is okay. On the contrary, actually, the language is considered offensive and vulgar for a reason, and I am attempting to articulate what that reason must be. I think it's important to understand why something is wrong. My conclusion is that the personal is political, and so how we engage with each other, even when there are no consequences, still matters, which would actually require affirming that intent does matter. And so normalization of this kind of language internally reaffirms latent oppressive beliefs, and the severity of these issues, or the hateful origin or ramification of these words, is downplayed, even if nobody else in that space is around to be upset at the time. Even to take on the image of a malicious oppressor satirically is still reaffirming oppression internally. It is an act of lazy satire. If a group of straight men make fun of gay sex in a locker room, it is still homophobic, even if no gay men are there to hear it. and that position cannot be reached through consequentialism, so the action must be understood to be wrong regardless of consequence. Thaddeus Metz deconstructs this welfare's response to slurs in their paper, Exactly Why Are Slurs Wrong?, positing that a slur is nonetheless wrong because despite the unlikelihood of harm to you, a failure to prize friendliness with you remains. In communicating to those besides you that the idea that you can be identified with negative traits simply because of your membership in a group, the one slurring is acting in an unfriendly and particularly divisive way towards you. Essentially, regardless of consequence, you are behaving in an unkind manner and not with upstanding character. A description I feel is apt of much of the drag scene, not excluding myself. I will link to this paper if you would like to read it for yourself. Given what has returned to light this year about other drag performers, it is evident that the issue of offensive language in comedy for shock value extends far beyond myself or any former or present social circles which I belong to, and even to some of the louder voices for change back in June. Frankly, this should have been self-evident, due to the fact that ableism is a systemic and social issue, and not an individualist moral failing. And to present it as such actually does a massive disservice to discussion, education, and activism on the topic of ableism. In truth, I did find it to be incredibly confusing to be accused of being the source of foundational scene ableism, when I am not only a relatively new performer in the canon of Scottish drag, but I, and many still active drag artists in the scene, are well aware of performances relying on offensive comedy or ableist social structures existing long before Skinny Minnie or even Andrew came along. I am also aware of many other performers engaging in the exact same language and comedy that was exposed, in large part due to the fact that I spent the week between Stephanie and I's public cancellations being told by pretty much everybody I spoke to that everyone says things like that in private, and my own anecdotal experience of bearing witness to this behaviour from others. Indeed, I think it's fairly obvious that the intention on the part of every single person who has exposed screenshots, including myself, has been to demonstrate that you are just as bad as who you are attacking. This has only transpired because of hypocritical, moral, high-ground stances of those outwardly attacking others, whether it is because they are lacking entirely in self-awareness or they are deliberately attempting to conceal their engagement with problematic language or humour, differs situationally. I do not think anyone could or should sit idly by while they are called a bigot by someone that they have evidence of behaving in the exact same way. I think the social lesson here should be not to throw stones in glass houses and to not weaponise the image of activism to take someone down unless you are without sin, because that sin will come out eventually. These nukes continue to drop indefinitely now due to the new landscape of the community, as individuals continually present themselves as free of sin, when inevitably they are not. There is now a clear incentive to betray and expose one another, as not only will you look morally righteous and superior, but you will materially benefit. I would say that Shigo Sinner and Callum Raymond Young have been the most guilty of this, in my opinion. I also know that there are several other performers who are very scared of me implicating them, as they have either used or sat idly by in the presence of offensive language. I'm not interested in exposing them at this time. But this is why I have historically never involved myself online in these situations, because I am unwilling to pipe up to attack others for behaviour that I know I am guilty of. I have been unwilling to join in any dogpile since the pandemic, and to be clear, none of us are without sin. I am, of course, ableist, in the same way that I am misogynistic and transphobic. Everybody raised in a society with those accesses of oppression is in some way and to some extent indoctrinated with those beliefs and is on a lifelong journey to continue scrubbing themselves free of unconscious bias and ignorance, and they will inevitably make mistakes along the way. What is important is not that you never make mistakes, but how you deal with and move on from them. To be open to understanding and education, to signpost yourself as being open to being a better ally. This is actually very hard to do when you are constantly being called inauthentic for no discernible reason, except to prolong someone's humiliation and suffering, regardless of what you do or say, and if your crime has been deemed as unforgivable. I have always taken severe umbrage with the concept that the way that bigotry functions is that there are bigots and there are non-bigots, and that all the bigots hide amongst the non-bigots, completely aware that their views are socially unacceptable, and deliberately concealing those views to avoid punishment or social exclusion by the much larger, more powerful group of non-bigots. And that when you do slip up and are inevitably found out, the punishment is to be sent to Bigot Island, where you are separated from all the non-bigots, thus cleansing society of all the bad apples and allowing equality to flourish as is the natural state of being. This is an incredibly childish and naive view of how bigotry functions and how the social axes of oppression function. Frankly, this stalls any progress towards real change, because that would involve engaging with people who you consider to have behaved in a bigoted manner. Unfortunately, people who have behaved poorly do not simply vanish from being because you have decided they must, and it is a poor choice as an activist to deliberately alienate and reject someone who has apologised, admitted to their wrongdoings, and is attempting to better themselves as an ally, as this actually redirects people further towards real bigotry. That is how radicalisation happens. The thought has definitely crossed my mind, and I imagine the mind of many others in my situation, that it would be so much easier to not be apologetic, that to be unrepentant and to brand everybody else as just too sensitive would be easier. However, my values are, and will continue to be my values, and I am committed to being a better version of myself. What does need to be understood, though, in plain terms, is that there is a difference between an unrepentant ideological enemy of equality and somebody who is engaged with cheap, offensive, shock value comedy. While, of course, nobody engaging in good faith with a rational and sound mind would ever want to be referred to as a bigot, or in this case an ableist, the reality is that all human beings raised in a society which subjugates disabled people will have residual and latent ableist beliefs. By trying to ascribe ableism as a moral failing that only bad people would do, you reinforce that system of oppression, as many good people are in fact ableist. Many friends of yours, performers that you like, or indeed, more than likely, you. The overwhelming majority of ableism does not stem from extremists or eugenicists who loudly call for the extermination of disability or the curing of disability. It comes from average people who engage often unknowingly with latently ableist beliefs and conduct. How often have you seen someone wear a straitjacket for Halloween, or otherwise appropriate imagery of the institutionalized, or engage with media which depicts mental asylums as scary and unsafe? Have you ever considered the fact that American Horror Story or Outlast are consistently ableist pieces of media? What about utilising crutches, oxygen tanks, or wheelchairs to create a fashion statement? What about applying burns or scarring SFX for edgy horror looks, something which the skin difference community has continually detracted as stigmatising? What about referring to somebody as insane, deranged, lame, dumb, or a gimp? All words which reinforce negative beliefs about disability. These are all microaggressive acts of ableism which reinforce deeper ableist narratives in our society. For instance, in the world of drag specifically, the belief that your show's poster and visual aesthetic is more important than clarity and brevity, a lack of incorporating closed captioning or a transcript for your videos, or neglecting to outline a venue's access information on application forms, signposts the needs of disabled people as a non-priority to you. There are innumerate performers who engage in ableist ignorance with the examples that I just outlined alone, and many of those people have thrown stones in my direction, labelling me as an anti-disabled bigot and passing judgment on my so-called views, while failing themselves to pass the simplest of accessibility checks. Why is it that every show in Scotland can post a dissertation on how it doesn't support slurs, which is a position so obvious that you may as well have put up a statement saying the grass is green, but so few can outline venue access information, provide image descriptions on grid posts, or closed captioning on their Instagram stories? That is because it is easy and fun to engage in outrage culture, but it is difficult to do the actual work of prioritising disabled people in your day-to-day personal and professional life. Putting all of this aside, I want to make it very clear that it is completely intellectually dishonest to hold me accountable for the actions of other people, or others accountable for my actions. The fallacy of guilt by association, or targeting others as complicit, needs to end. You cannot be held accountable for something that you did not do. Actually, I don't believe that anyone can be held accountable for anything. Accountability is a choice one makes, and demonstrates accountability on any given subject by having your actions match your words. For example, Rujazzle has excessively been referred to as either complicit in ableism or outright ableist herself, exclusively for the fact that she was present in the screenshot where I said fuck disabled people, and she did not call it out. That was Shigo Sinner's singular reason for removing her as the host of the Drag Awards. I hope that what I've clarified so far would explain why Rujazzle would have had absolutely no reason to call that out. To be abundantly clear regarding Rujazzle, she was not present in any chat except Mamaru's Angels, and nothing actually ableist was said in front of her in the screenshot that has been posted. She has been labelled a bigoted ableist with literally no evidence to support this claim. For what it's worth, as an autistic person, I've always felt that Rujazzle has been one of the only people to validate me, my lived experience, and never judge me for my sometimes difficult to deal with symptoms. The dogpiling of her that happened that weekend, and especially how intense things were made for her before literally anything else was posted pertaining to her specifically, was opportunistic and immoral. Further, as someone who has spent significant time in the drag scene before becoming Rujazzle's friend, I am fully aware, as is she, of how frequently people detract her as robotic, and additionally, how often she has been non-consensually diagnosed by others as clearly autistic. I'd ask you to consider why you simultaneously believe Ru to be autistic and then feel it is appropriate to shame her for being cold, distant, or having a socially robotic communication style. That is ableism. For the purposes of my argument, I am going to have to point to examples outside of ableism going forward, but it's important to recognise that the argument of complicity has been applied to any and all social issues and any acts of a problematic nature. The argument of complicity hinges on the concept that by choosing to work with me in the event that I had said something ableist, Rujazzle would therefore be complicit in my ableism. I am not personally of the belief that working with someone is an endorsement of their every action, and I think this is a mentality which reflects the bubble of the drag scene. In the outside world, people have colleagues, bosses, or even employees who think or behave in ways that they disagree with, or work for companies which they do not stand for morally. If your co-worker at Tesco cheats on his girlfriend, are you therefore complicit in adultery for not quitting on the spot? If your boss doesn't vote, are you then complicit in war crimes for continuing to work for them? The idea that every person that you spend time with must think and behave identically to you, both in your work and personal life, is unreasonable and arguably a little bit fascist. Even among marginalised groups, there is no monolithic opinion. Listen to disabled voices. I am a disabled voice, and I do not agree with you. There are a lot of disabled voices which do not agree with you. To refuse to acknowledge that is ableism. We cannot be perfect minorities only when we agree with you and discardable when we don't. For that matter, there are plenty of drag queens, such as Jude, who work publicly a day job for companies like McDonald's, who are key targets of the Israel boycott, and they are not the subject of public pressure to quit in solidarity on social issues. Meanwhile, Eden Spaghetti felt comfortable instigating public negativity and calls for criticism towards Rujazzle when she was booked for a corporate pride event with Nestle last year. To get this rationale straight, as Eden is friends with and has booked Jude in the past, which should result in allegations of complicity by her own alleged metric, it is okay to work for problematic businesses out of drag, but not in drag, even though when drag is your full-time job, there would be literally no difference. Do you know that being able to turn down freelance work based on your moral principles is a privilege? Eden then proceeded to post several falsehoods in an attempt to make this much larger than it was. For example, proclaiming that Rujazzle had accepted a brand deal with Nestle and was promoting child slavery, which is just laughable when you know the reality is that Rujazzle hosted a quiz to 15 people in a boardroom. This wasn't enough, so more recently, Eden had to insinuate that Rujazzle and costume designer Jilly Jean King promoted Nazi imagery because of a costume which consisted of 2 lightning bolts. When confronted on this, Eden said, "I am harsher on Ru because I just don't like her." Firstly, this behaviour is not healthy, and secondly, it is bad faith. It reminds me of a famous Tumblr account from the early 2010s, which is called Your Fave is Problematic, which deliberately dug up and took out of context any action they could to paint any celebrity by request as a bigot. Disliking someone and then trying to retroactively crapshoot some valid moralistic reason to do so is a complete bastardization of activism. It appears that Eden never moved past this ideological stance of the 2010s, because what does this cartoonish overstatement of harm actually achieve? It's not like this behaviour is isolated for Eden either, seeing as she attacked me publicly on the assumption that I had to have been at an afters egging on Stephanie's use of slurs when I was, in actual fact, miles away of the time and unaware of what had transpired, and that by being silent on it the morning after, I was therefore complicit. For one, Stephanie and I are both grown adults, and neither of us are responsible for the behaviour of each other. But have you ever considered something called a conversation? Is there a reason that Eden always jumps to a call-out thread with an overstatement of harm, rather than a DM to discuss the issue? What exactly was the goal in blasting me publicly for an event that you had to knowingly lie about to associate me with? Accusing me of booking Stephanie for Suck, while fully aware that Suck was Rue and Rue's show alone. What exactly is so productive about stewing in rage in your house over something you think I've done and not asking me about it directly? It would save you so much time and energy and perhaps get you closer to the results you want if you treated people that you don't like as though they are still human beings. I am not an unreachable world leader. If you message me to ask me about something, then I will reply. You are very aware that I am unafraid of dialogue or confrontation, so why never engage me in it? Here is some food for thought. Did you know that this year, several prominent Scottish drag performers did corporate pride gigs with Barclays, who are one of the main targets of the Israel boycott? I know this because I was originally booked for it, and I was replaced due to obvious circumstances. Shigo did a corporate pride gig for Barclays last year, in the same week that Rujazzle did her corporate pride gig for Nestle. Shigo also publicly promoted this on her feed. Will we be calling Shigo a Zionist then? Of course, no thread calling attention or critique to this from Eden was to be found, despite it being publicly shared by all acts involved both last year and this year. Selective behaviour like this, or the fact that Eden attended Chapel Rome with Lilith almost immediately after she was exposed by Stephanie and her real-life friend for the use of racial slurs, is why I have chosen to refer to Eden as farcical in the past. It's really hard for me to draw any other conclusion on Eden's politics, given the prospective consequences and condemnation she felt that Stephanie was deserving of, yet absolved Lilith of entirely. To address one final thing as it pertains to Eden, she also referred to me as classist, alleging that I put her down as lesser than for shopping in Primark, and she decided to make this about how expensive their drag is in comparison to my own, which is both absurd and false. Firstly, I hail from a working class background, which anyone who knows me personally or beyond drag could verify. I grew up with very little money. Secondly, exactly how much or how little of my disposable income I spend on drag is entirely my prerogative, but consider, as someone that didn't drink until 2022, who hasn't been on holiday since before the pandemic, and who has only made one significant purchase for myself out of drag in the last 5 years, a hair transplant surgery, investing in my career has been my focus, and so I do have more custom drag than the average drag queen hobbyist. Eden, and for that matter Carrie Ann Crow, and their continuous attempts to villainise or shame me for utilising and supporting a small queer business in Jilly Jean King is both asinine and embarrassing. What exactly is the difference between Gillian making a dozen custom outfits for me or if I was to commission Eden? She is my friend, and so when I have the money to do so, I want to support my friends. I have never once dictated that drag is only valid if it is expensive or custom. On the contrary, every time I've judged a competition, I've actually voted for the win to go to someone who was either in self-made or off-the-rack drag. Nor have I ever flaunted this perceived wealth of mine in anyone's face merely by existing in my own clothes. If you are keeping track of what I spend my money on, then you need to think about me less. How I spend my money is not something that anyone is entitled to hold an opinion on. I invest in nice and specific drag because I like to express myself and because it makes me feel good. I am allowed to do so, and you are not permitted to hold an opinion on this, especially one that classes me as a bigot. No, Eden, I was not being classist. I was calling you out because you attacked my friend for working for Nestle, and then I proceeded to walk in on you shopping at the most notoriously unethical fast fashion chain. It is of absolutely no consequence to me how cheap your drag is or is not, because I frankly don't care. Your drag is completely irrelevant to me. I care that you are a hypocrite. You are not unintelligent, and you are aware that my comment wasn't rooted in classism. It just simply disrupts your self-concept as morally holier than thou, because you do, in fact, give your money to businesses which employ child labour, and more recently, you have now worked with performers who have engaged with either bigoted language or the use of slurs, something that you have attacked several people for unnecessarily and publicly. And in fact, you even took it upon yourself to contact several venues to advocate for the unbooking of those performers, including the venue which now hosts Lilith. Not just in my circumstance, but historically. How can you position Climax as a social utopia when you'll knowingly rub shoulders with those who have engaged with offensive terminology as recently as this year? Authentic activism is applied in all circumstances, not just against those that you have a bias against, self-admittedly, and frankly should be applied to yourself first. Eden Spaghetti's long-standing, continual, selective application of their ethics while positioning themselves as a revolutionary leader and safe space is alarming. I would love one day, Eden, to see your words match your actions, because as it stands, by your own metrics, you are complicit in bigotry, and therefore there is no word to describe you except farcical. Before any trope is parroted towards me of friends can disagree on favourite foods, but not on human rights, that is not my argument. I am not saying you need to go out and become friends with real bigots like Jordan Peterson or Blair White, or even that you need to be a part of their de-radicalisation, or that anyone needs to be friends with me. Firstly, this would require arguing that my fuck disabled comment was bigoted ableism when, as I have spent considerable time explaining now, it was not, and that is an inarguable fact. My position is, while you are free to make the personal choice to avoid working with whoever you choose for whatever reason you see fit, as it is your life and no one can impose any rule set upon you, attempting to apply a label of complicity with severe punishment attached to another for not making the same choice as you is mere guilt by association fallacy. I don't have any issue with the fact that Eden is making posters for Lilith. But, again, how is this morally compatible with Eden's worldview? She has applied extreme pressure in several other cases for the social exclusion of those who have behaved similarly to Lilith, and even attempted to inflict a similar fate upon me for a mere association with Stephanie. Might I add, at that time, Eden had spent significantly more time as Stephanie's friend than I have. This is a manipulative move to incite fear and a moral panic. Am I just as bad as the perpetrator? No, of course you are not. Working alongside somebody who has committed an act of wrongdoing is not morally comparable to committing an act of wrongdoing yourself. Eden did not say a slur, Lilith did. We have seen this so many times over and over again in the drag scene. You are not allowed to be anywhere near someone who did anything wrong, even if they have apologised, even if they have grown and changed. You are relying upon an innocent person's terror of being targeted by proximity by a mob, which is abusive and isolationist. What again makes this angle of complicity even more frustrating to contend with is that it is deliberately vague and selectively applied. Again, consider the fact that Rujazzle had to be held to account for continuing to book me after bearing witness to this unproblematic comment in Mamaru's Angels. Putting aside the fact that if you were actually aware of our work dynamic since that comment was made in 2023, you would be aware that it was primarily myself booking Rue for events, and not the other way around, as it was my decision to make her a resident of both Hoots and Boozy Brushes, which is a reality which simply does not suit your narrative about us, and more importantly, wouldn't give you any grounds to attack her, and therefore is refused. Rujazzle did not embolden me to make jokes that she wasn't aware that I made, just as I'm sure Eden didn't embolden Lilith to make jokes that she wasn't aware of. We are all adults and we can all make our own mistakes. I'd also like to note that Eden tore Rue apart for continuing to work with me after Rue's statement about Suck distancing itself from me. Obviously, Rue was given no choice except to do that, not only by the scene, but the venue, which is why she posted that in the first place. And again, further had no choice when she was being unfairly defamed and cancelled as a result of her proximity to my actions. False and unverified statements notwithstanding. Eden then followed this by tearing Rue apart for remaining my friend and in contact with me, behind the scenes. We are friends, not colleagues. And this is frankly fairly disgusting when you consider that that would mean Eden believes that Rujazzle should have personally abandoned me in the immediate aftermath of a mental health crisis. Many of my other so-called friends did so, but I for one am very grateful that Rujazzle has not. This would also call into question why Eden has disavowed Lilith publicly when Stephanie exposed her private conduct, but has continued to create content for Gloss and even attended Chapel Rome with her. It is morally dishonest to apply standards to others that you have no desire to follow yourself. Though I am sure now, with the shoe on the other foot, Eden may understand why you would continue to hold a relationship with a vulnerable and neurodiverse person who has behaved in a socially unacceptable manner, as I chose to do with Stephanie and Rujazzle chose to do with me. I'd argue that there are actually plenty of people who are complicit and have gone without criticism, like Lorraine Mundy or Yanis Cleary, who have spent close to a decade now uploading videos of offensive performances without critique, or in the case of Yanis, removed that problematic material upon request to allow certain performers to escape accountability from their ignorant past, continue to feign moral purity, and even support and uplift those acts while staying silent, aware of their misdeeds. I don't wish to name this performer publicly, but as evidenced by the unearthed ableist performances of amphetamines and self-admissions of Salvatore's as emblematic of what was socially acceptable in the scene at the time, anyone who frequented the scene between 2016 and 2019 will be aware that there is someone who is presently enjoying not only just forgiveness for only the tip of the iceberg concerning her being unearthed publicly, but huge opportunities both in and beyond the scene, who arguably engaged more than anyone else with incredibly offensive and problematic satire and built her platform as a scene comedy legend upon that. I'm not naming this performer, and you will note she's the only performer which I have not named for public actions, because if she wants to admit to this now, she has the opportunity to do so, seeing as how foolish Shigo, Amphetamine and Callum Raymond Young have made themselves look by not doing so. You have downplayed your involvement, and you know it. I know firsthand that this performer asked Yanis to remove all footage of their problematic behaviour from his channel, to which he complied. To me, that is the textbook definition of complicity. Before anyone who is actually aware of who I'm referring to wants to respond to me with, "It's been years, she's changed," I can tell you firsthand that I watched this performer make monkey noises as a joke at a performer of colour in front of myself, Lilith and Demipoint at DragCon 2023. So, is it change, or is it a deliberate and concentrated effort to conceal the truth? It's almost like this offensive and edgy sense of humour is part and parcel of the wider drag scene and not an individualist issue, as comedy of this nature continues to be unearthed across the entire spectrum of the queer performance scene as of late. While I don't think there's any point in cross-examining Lorraine Mundy, as her loyalty to amphetamine has been evident for years and stayed strong even after Anne's admission to sexually predatory behaviour, I did, however, choose to take up Yanis on his assertion of being open to dialogue concerning his videos and YouTube channel after my ex-partner was evidently pressured into retracting their position of his complicity publicly. I opened this dialogue as his tweets read, "No video has been taken down without the request of the performer or the venue," which was quite simply untrue, as I had never asked Yanis to remove videos of me, and neither had Alana Duvet, Darmageddon, Glasgow University, or the Britannica Panopticon. I then proceeded to have a particularly frustrating conversation with Yanis, as he ignored everything that I had to say pertaining to the performer which I have just referenced, likely to avoid any screenshots confirming the truth or implicating Yanis' true involvement, nor would he budge from the position that he does not endorse Anne's performance choices, and continually presented the argument that uncritical observation and uploading is distinct from platforming and complicity. I find this deeply ironic for reasons which I'm sure are obvious, as Rujazzle's mere presence and uncritical observation in a group chat has been enough to brand her as an ableist bigot. But because Yanis then went on to assert that in fact he did remove videos of me of his own accord, contrary to what was publicly suggested, to express solidarity to those hurt by my behaviour and to not be considered as in support of me. The problem here is that depiction is either an endorsement or it is not, and you cannot have this both ways. As I said to him, if he did not believe that uncritical depiction was endorsement, then he would have had no sound logic to remove his videos of me, and certainly would not have been able to argue without contradiction that hosting videos of Anne performing problematic behaviour on his channel was not endorsement. I also heavily documented a lot of the drag performances between 2019 and 2021, which can be found online today, and I referenced the other filmographers in Lorraine and Yanis because I believe their YouTube channels are foundational tools of scene lore, and the uncritical uploading of offensive performances reinforced them at the time as acceptable. Again, moving past this bad apple conception of bigotry is understanding how we all influence and reinforce the problem. We are society. It is not some amorphous blob, and our choices shape it. Returning now to the current state of drag, I would ask why this angle of complicity and guilt by association has been applied in certain cases but not others. There appears to be some scene-wide embargo on working with myself, Rujazzle, or the Corset Club, but not with Shigo Sinner. In order to believe that Rujazzle is complicit in ableism for working with me, then a belief would necessarily follow that Latex is complicit in ableism for joining the cast of Gag once Shigo's use of ableist slurs came to light. To my knowledge, Latex is not disabled, and therefore her decision to instantly forgive Shigo's ableism is suspect, given how many factors would be to her material benefit. And I have already provided evidence on Twitter of conversations happening between the acts of Queens Aloud, which speak to the inauthenticity surrounding their motives of diversity and inclusion, conversations which Latex would have been present for. Everything I'm saying would also apply to Venus, who you'll recall was among the original group of people to call for Stephanie's deplatforming for the use of slurs, and who tweeted their hesitance to condemn Stephanie's use of slurs was as a result of the fear of her career being negatively affected. Now, she has forgiven Shigo's use of slurs to the benefit of her career, when she, to my knowledge, is also not disabled. To Venus's credit, she was willing to forgive Stephanie and did so privately, understanding a lack of negative intent in her language, but the point is that Venus evidently has no fear, nor has received any ramifications for, aligning herself with Shigo. Personally, I find believing that Shigo Sinner has had the change of heart to suddenly behave authentically to be a fairly tall order, the 3 months of complete false presentations of herself notwithstanding, given that one of the final conversations that she had with me in Delmonico's was, it's not about what you say, it's about if you get caught saying it, which I now understand is a position that she even parroted when working in Newcastle, as the queens there were happy to inform me of when I visited. Or the fact that she has bragged around the scene for years about helping clear another performer's socials of several hundred instances of slurs and offensive jokes before they went to film a TV show. Because, again, everyone speaks like this behind closed doors. But, primarily, due to how ruthlessly she chose to set the standard for how Rujazzle should be dealt with for alleged complicity in ableism by removing her from the Scottish Drag Awards for the mere act of not calling me out for saying fuck disabled people, prior to anything else being alleged. Only now to beg for mercy and to be allowed the chance to grow with the show when her use of actually ableist language was brought to light. It's also probably relevant to mention that I and others have made offensive jokes or used offensive language in Shigo's company, and that she has partaken in it with me herself. She has never called me out in the moment, or expressed any issue with it at the time, which is why I'm not convinced of her version of events concerning Hummingbird Brunch, or any of the motives in pushing to deplatform those that she did. Here are the plain facts of the situation. Shigo opportunistically took advantage of what was happening, while well aware of her own behaviour. How on earth can Shigo justify cutting Rujazzle from her show for a crime inferior to hers, one that Shigo knew she had partaken in, which she has now refused to step down for? It is all a circus, a performance, a farce. By this logic, it would then follow that Shigo Sinner, Transgender, Carrie-Anne Crow, Marla Sinner, etc. are all equally complicit for working with and staying friends with and or platforming Amphetamine after her numerous ableist performances which they bore witness to, putting aside the admission to sexually predatory behaviour which they were also all aware of and defended her from at the time. It's interesting how these performances were on stage for all to see, giggled and gawked at by people that you now refer to as scene legend, and tucked away on foundational YouTube channels to be watched at afters, yet the rumours and whispers about who is a secret bigot were never directed towards Amphetamine. If your face fits, I suppose. If you are friends with a bigot, then you are a bigot, said Oliver Attention. So what have the trigger queens been for years then? Who is reaching out to Rujazzle with Skinny with kindness and support? Oliver, please take this energy to Eden and Lilith if you feel so strongly, because that is your community and those are your friends. And activism should start at home. You attended Lilith's show for several years. Your partner won her competition. How do you have more to say about the character of those that you've met only a handful of times than the conduct of your Dundee matriarch that you spent every week with? In my view, to express compassion and understanding towards a friend who has made a mistake or engage with a social faux pas is a good thing, actually, as it gives them a shame-free space to grow. What's most embarrassing in Oliver's case is how much they've engaged in offensive comedy or language in their life, even in front of me, and indeed in footage that they are well aware exists, but outwardly present this holier-than-thou front. Personally, I'm glad, Oliver, that you were given the shame-free space to grow from saying slurs or utilising ableist comedy, and it's unfortunate that you won't extend that grace to other people. This no friends allowed logic isn't mine, it's yours, because I don't think this, you do. Or at least you adopt this language in order to attack Rujazal for actions she hasn't taken and ascribe a label of complicity, but then reject it to defend those that you like. It's permissible for Eden to be friends with Lilith, or for Franz to be friends with Anne, but Rujazal cannot be friends with Skinny. I'll also put aside the fact that it's proven in research that shame is one of the least effective social justice tools, and that forcing everyone's friends to personally abandon them against their will can lead to horrific consequences, which I can personally attest to, none of which include the personal growth or change that you so express as your desire. A friend should know somebody's character beyond their worst moments and be part of their journey of growth and self-improvement, as Eden is now clearly doing with Lilith. Let's take as an example Marla Sinner, who has been permitted to take zero accountability for awarding an ableist performance a challenge win due to the fact that she was harassed by one anonymous troll account, and has even gone so far to manipulatively present herself as being targeted specifically for having an ED, despite the fact that this account attacked numerous people in a similar fashion because of childish name-calling. Marla has now successfully played the victim and enjoyed a sympathy-filled retirement, rather than demonstrate any modicum of accountability. I was called a lot of names too, some of which harp on insecurities of my own, but considering that fact, nor the fact that anything that happened as a result of the public shaming I endured, was permitted to negate anything that I'd done, by Marla and her friends specifically, I'm not sure why that happening to Marla would be any different. Concerning myself, Kiko said, "What happened is sad, but it changes nothing." I'm happy to extend that exact same compassion towards Marla. Or, if you stand to materially or financially gain by participating in sheer doublethink of what counts as complicity, like Latex has, who has frankly sold out by her own apparent standards with Bohemia, while now taking a residency under Shigo Sinner, it's hard to think that Latex actually believes anything that she's saying, because she contradicts herself so effortlessly, and noticeably when she gets the chance to have the flashy residency and work with Drag Race queens. In my opinion, Latex is one of the most egregious examples of weaponising ableism opportunistically, as I don't think there's any reading of her behaviour that isn't that she cares only when it stands to benefit her, and no longer cares when it would be to her detriment. Ideally, I think Latex's next project should be creating a poster which can be read without a magnifying glass, as her recent posters for gag are some of the most inaccessible I have ever seen created in the drag scene, especially by someone belonging to a group allegedly working tirelessly towards creating a more inclusive space. To return to Eden Spaghetti once again as an example, it's not lost on me that she and her partner Salvatore chose to weaponise allegations of problematic conduct to remove a rival competing show hosted at the same venue which they ran Climax from, which gave Eden a monopoly over that venue and its clientele. Where has this energy been for deplatforming Lilith and cancelling Gloss? Where are the public email scripts and call to action to contact Beat Generator to remove their problematic queen? Except that did happen, and those people were kicked out of Beat Generator, only to be replaced by Lilith, who has now been exposed for the exact same behaviour. There is a clear incentive to Eden's actions beyond authentic activism, and indeed a clear bias in who she chooses to attack. To be clear, I'm not saying that I don't think performers can't or shouldn't work with Shigo or Lilith. On the contrary, I think the fact that people have decided to work with them is fabulous, as it shows some room for freedom of thought and self-determination. My point is that nobody should have this decision made for them, and that everyone should be allowed to make this decision on their own about whether to work with Shigo or Lilith, or for myself for that matter. And that there should be some moral consistency with the application of this. Likewise, with this in mind, it was exceptionally inappropriate for Shigo's friend Candy Walls to publicly harass a teenager for being booked on the same bill as me, and I've had plenty of conversations now with close to a dozen queens who either want to work with me or spend time with me, but are too scared of being publicly targeted by the scene to do so. I'm also confused by the behaviour of the cast of Gag Race, who all walked due to what was brought to light concerning the judges, yet now several prospective contestants have either performed at or attended Gag since. To me, this demonstrates that their decision was not made out of moral concern, but rather fear of targeting by proximity, and indeed this holds true for those who quit the Corset Club. However, when there was not the same level of scene fallout concerning Shigo, it once again became permissible to work with her. It's not about your morals, it's not about what's right or wrong, it's about what will get you cancelled for being associated with. This is mere conflict avoidance and staying out of drama, not rocking the boat. I also think it's worth noting who within the scene decided that a mere week off from Gay for Play and Gag was enough of a demonstration of accountability or time for growth concerning Shigo's malicious use of slurs and proceeding to lie about it for months thereafter, or that Lilith's apology, in which she claimed to be taking a permanent step away from performing, was authentic, only for her to then promote her show the following month with another poster created by Eden Spaghetti, but felt as though Stephanie should never have been allowed to show her face in public again, or that somehow I was acting in breach of my own words by continuing to perform at private events over the summer. If Latex and Venus can publicly put their face next to a queen who has said ableist slurs without fear of backlash against them for complicity, then there is no reason I see why Glasgow's newest queer venue is now devoid of drag queens, except cowardice and the aforementioned fear of targeting by proximity. It's extremely embarrassing, in my opinion, for the Scottish queer scene that its newest queer venue, the Corset Club, does not have a single drag queen working at it, or that Callum's performance roster has now become significantly less diverse since my time working there. Taking my deep personal hurt out of the equation, Callum's crimes are entirely equivalent to Shigo's, and this hardline mentality of human discardation for any wrongdoing is destroying the drag industry in our country. Look around you. How many shows or opportunities are there? Not just because of the removal of not one, not two, but 3 prominent producers and an entire venue, but because anybody remaining with either the capability or desire to produce events is probably too scared to bring the spotlight onto themselves. Explain to me how Shigo Sinner is in control of Glasgow's most prolific gay venue, responsible and capable of booking slots despite proof of ableist wrongdoing, but innocent performers are forced out of work due to fear of cancellation of proximity because of something Callum did. If it's permissible for Shigo to keep Delmonicas, and especially that Latex and Venus can choose to openly work with her without criticism, then Slutdrop Sally and Molly Coddle should have been allowed to work at the Corset Club unfettered. I believe in everybody's ability to make informed choices, which can only take place when all information is on the table. People should be allowed to arrive at their own conclusions and make their own decisions about what they think is right. If you know me, you'll know that's a belief I've held for a very long time concerning other performers with allegations of problematic behaviour. I want all of the information and then I will decide for myself, and I will not be told what to think. Yes, I did say fuck disabled people, and now you know why. So hopefully you'll be able to hold a more well-rounded opinion on the claim that Skinny Minnie is an ableist bigot. The ability to make an informed choice is impossible if past behaviour has been deliberately covered up or ignored, whether that be Yanis Cleary knowingly concealing problematic performances, or when people such as Salvatore and Aster choose to forget situations like Amphetamine's admission to sexual predation allegations, which is unbelievably ironic on Salvatore's part. There is no avoiding that Salvatore chose to enter a competition that she knew was being judged by an admitted sexual predator, and you do have to take that in tandem with the greater context of all of Salvatore's behaviour in June. You alleged that the Glasgow drag scene was so evil that being pushed out of it was the best thing that ever happened to you. Then you enter a competition that you know full well is set to be judged by an admitted sexual predator. By the Glasgow drag scene, you mean Rujazzle and I, one person of 4 who voted to remove your suck residency, and one person who had nothing to do with it. It's clear how much of your words were just bitterness disguised as activism. You knew firsthand the new hosts were no different. I made so many attempts in recent years to extend an olive branch towards you, Salvatore. I wanted to mend our relationship and work through the issues that you decided to have with me during the pandemic. You were literally my first real friend in the drag scene, and it's so ironic to me now that what initially tore us apart was when you sided with someone's use of offensive and inappropriate language and rape comedy about me. You did nothing but allow me to be villainized in that situation back then, despite knowing the facts of the situation. So I have no belief that you whatsoever that you weren't aware of the offensive language and comedy that Lilith was using more recently too. But that rape joke is something I'll dive into more another time. The thing about an informed choice is it requires a dialogue to take place, to approach the topic with compassion and nuance, because there is always three sides to every story: my version, your version, and the truth. Deliberately removing the ability for your opponent to speak, you create only one acceptable line of thinking, to which any dissent has been punished with social ostracization. There's a quote from a comedian called Chris Fleming: "You call yourself a community leader, but you're not on speaking terms with your roommate." I am still a full-time drag performer, I am still offered regular drag work, and I will continue to take it. I am part of your community, and that is not something that you have a choice in, unfortunately. Do you understand that this process is going to involve engaging with me and my thoughts at some point or another? Even if it's purely from an epistemological standpoint, to understand what went so wrong with me. If the scene is better off without someone like me in it, then what cautionary lessons could be learned from my mistakes? As I think I've explained already, the bad apple bigot theory is useless. The fact is, if I was to open my DMs to the public, then you would see a lot of people who do not agree with everything that's went down, whether it's the rationale, the methods, or the solutions. And that includes very loud and powerful voices which were on your side in June. I have had so many people tell me that they only unfollowed me or signed the petition purely out of fear or pressure, and I know exactly what kind of behaviour they're going to be referring to, because I've been on the receiving end of Shigo's nippy messages before. "Hey Diva, notice that you still follow X. We'll need to cut you from Shook Digital Drag Show if you don't unfollow them, as we want it to be a safe environment." Which again, deliberately presents an innocent person's proximity to the offender, this time merely following someone, as threatening to the community's safety, when it is only about intimidating others. This is an implicit threat. You need to remove this person from your life in their entirety, delete all footage that you have with them, and publicly denounce them, never speak to them again, and henceforth pretend this person doesn't exist. Not because we reasonably believe you are in support of specifically their bad behaviour, but because it gives us a weapon to leverage against you. I know for a fact that Shigo was wading into the DMs of literal children to threaten them for liking an Instagram post of Rajazzles. That is not appropriate behaviour, and it is not activism. When any criticism of you, or how you behaved, or decisions that you've made need to be prefaced with, "I'm not defending Skinny, but..." That is because you have manipulated a situation where any disagreement with you whatsoever is tantamount to siding with me. That is a warning sign that you have controlled people, not convinced them. Nor do I believe that you would have access to the popularity argument concerning myself, i.e. the most popular opinion is that I must be exiled. Firstly, a position being held by the majority does not make it right or ethical. A majority of UK citizens voted for Brexit. This is an inherent weakness of the majority rule, and it's called the tyranny of majority. And it is generally how oppressive systems form. Secondly, was that number 749 signatures, because I do not need to exaggerate or minimise it for my argument, but do note how often that number was frequently overstated by its author and their companions, achieved through authentic belief, or through trickery and intimidation, by loud voices manipulating and controlling a narrative. If you don't sign this, then you stand against us, aka you have to sign this petition or we'll cancel you too. Your arguments have not won people over so much as you have terrified them. That is a sign that you are dealing with moral absolutism, which is black and white thinking, an us and them mentality. I am your community, and you cannot change that. People with power should be criticised. That was your argument, and I agree. I have always made my criticisms known, and I have always welcomed good faith criticisms of my own professional decisions. Carrie-Anne Crowe said that these conversations have been attempted to have been had in private for many years and been ignored, which is why it now must happen publicly. Which is just untrue. Nobody outside of my circle has ever, and I mean ever, attempted to approach me to discuss my professional conduct, especially through a lens of alleged bigotry. That is actually what prompted my discussion with Poppa, as I had publicly evidenced that he had never engaged me on the topic of ableism despite his assertions in his video otherwise. and during the conversation that we had, he conceded that I specifically had been tarred with the brush of others, particularly Rue, Chucky, and CJ, and had not been given a fair chance as a producer. I will happily explain any of my decisions, publicly or privately, right now, because I have never shied away from confrontation or dialogue. Allegedly, that makes me intimidating, which is sad, as my intention has always been to signpost open willingness to have dialogue, which you have all conceded consistently to not take me up on. Now, you have all taken the power, so the means by which you did so, why you did so, and what you now do with it, is also open to criticism by your own metrics, and nobody gets to decide who doesn't have a voice in this conversation. I think it's been long since time for some public transparency from me, because I'm very much tired of being told what I think or what I've done. Good faith debate is healthy, good faith criticism is healthy, and we are supposed to challenge each other. It's actually even morally healthy to debate the people on your side and to interrogate why the right thing is in fact right, which is why I dedicated so much time earlier to explaining exactly why the use of slurs in a private setting is still wrong. I know that there is disagreement, even amongst the loudest voices, about what was or wasn't right and when things finally went too far. But this conversation has been one-sided for a very long time, and that has been by design. I have been accused of silencing people before I had even spoken, and I was not given the opportunity to explain myself. And the wicked and gleeful culture of prolonging my humiliation as long as possible to settle old personal scores led to truly drastic consequences. No human being is built to endure what I was put through, and it is not shirking responsibility by any measure to say that my punishment did not fit my crime. Because if it had anything to do with the social issues at hand, then several others would have befell the same fate as me. It's not because you think I'm a bigot, it's because you think I'm a bitch. So why is that? Through my conversations in private with Papa Joint, I have now come to understand more than ever how my own internalized ableism, and in particular towards myself, has affected me, and how I operate both as a performer and as a person. As I've explained already, ableism, like any social structure, is deeply ingrained and goes beyond our initial observations or conscious behaviour. It requires continuous work to dismantle, and I am by no means an exception to that. The truth is, I have always been very uncomfortable with the concept of fully broadcasting my neurodivergence, or the fact that I am hard of hearing in one ear, which I actually don't think many people are aware of, nor do I believe I've ever expressed that fact publicly on this platform before. And I don't wish to put these things at the forefront of who I am or my drag. And that's not because I have any particular lack of acceptance for these parts of myself, but simply because I do not want to be defined by them, and I'm very uncomfortable with it being the first thing associated with either my art or myself. I found myself asking, why is that? Why have I felt the need to be so private about these facts, or disengage my true self so heavily from who Skinny Minnie is? Why is it that I'm so uncomfortable talking about having CPTSD, a diagnosis I've held for several years now? I've always wanted to be more than what happened to me, or some of my darkest parts. Prior to this situation, I would have considered myself confident, self-assured, and relatively unshakable. I did a lot of work to make myself that way, and I did not frequently concern myself with the opinions of others, because what other people think of me is not my business. Though feel free to articulate whatever you feel should be my business. I was pushed into an impossibly dark place and reopened wounds I long thought healed, and had so much new trauma inflicted that I don't know how long it is going to take to adjust to. It is very, very hard to have everyone you've ever known for the last decade screaming that you're one of the most despicable human beings alive, and to then have to recontextualize all of your interactions with those people through a new lens of hatred, only to then discover that so much of it was not authentic. I have had to spend a very long time rebuilding myself and understanding myself again, which is why it has taken me until now to post this. I have come to understand that, regardless of how public I am, or not, with my disabilities, I will just never be seen as disabled, despite how hurtful that has been at times. I remember, on one occasion, a tracks twink told me that Tina Justina's Majesty win was much more important than mine because she is neurodivergent. It hurt to watch the scene celebrate Tina as disabled excellence when the first Majesty was disabled too. It's not like I'm lacking in visibly neurodivergent traits, and it's not like several of those traits haven't been held against me in the past, whether it's info dumping, or bluntness, or a lack of eye contact, and even the fact that you were all calling me the spreadsheet queen. How many lineups have been bemoaned as lacking any disabled representation, which are now posthumously more diverse by my publicising of being hard of hearing? What assumptions have been made about me, or that have I presented myself, which has allowed those perceptions to form? It always hurt me that I have never been allowed to feel like I'm a success story of overcoming both physical and mental disabilities, which would have typically significantly quelled my ability to excel in the world of performance. As far as I know, I am the first and only hard of hearing person to have ever won a pageant in Scotland, and potentially the only physically disabled person whatsoever. That is something which deserves equal celebration to anyone's neurodiversity. Do you know how hard it is to be a dancing queen when you don't have 100% hearing? Let alone when your social environment is almost exclusively in loud and overstimulating nightlife? To need to have the microphone and the audio track louder than anyone else's? Here's something I'd ask you to consider. When you accuse me of being aggressive as a result of shouting in a club, do you know that to myself, I sound like I'm speaking at an average volume? Do you know that I've been in so many situations where I've been told I'm coming across as angry when I am only trying to be heard? Consider this combined with incompatible neurodivergent communication styles, and especially alcohol. I have always worked so hard because I am starting from a disadvantage that my peers won't even recognise. I get praised for my work ethic, but I have no other option. That is ableism. I've had so much time to reflect, and I'd say I recognise now that equally, some parts of this have been inflicted onto me by narratives which are beyond my control, and some of it is a result of my own decisions. I have always used drag as an armour to make myself untouchable. I have always felt my strongest when I am in drag, and to have that taken from me resulted in the vulnerability to confront these emotions, and why I want Skinny Minnie to be so unaffected by those parts of who I am. Here's the thing though, despite everything, I am still proud of who I am, my flaws and all. I am very grateful that this experience has not changed that. I'm not asking anyone who's watched this to retract or delete anything, unless with a fuller picture of events you reach the conclusion on your own that that would be the right thing to do. However, I do hope you'll be able to move forward with the understanding that the assertion that I am an ableist bigot is misinformed and unfair. I have received such meaningful compassion and support from other disabled people, including my ex, Cian Butler, and especially Papa Joint, but I have struggled significantly with public statements from Franz or Latex which discuss my views. Not only as this refuses to take into account my denouncement of my own behaviour, which there would have been no reason for me to do if I didn't regret my actions, or if I considered the hurt that I caused negligible, but also the additional surrounding context on other matters, which I hope I have now demonstrated were presented as much more sinister than the reality. A single conversation with me would have clarified this, and seeing as I've known both of these performers for half a decade, their complete lack of respect for me is very disappointing. It's become clear to me now just how many relationships within the drag community I had that I overestimated, and that has hurt a lot. I do understand and hold no resentment towards the majority of people who were caught up in that moral panic which swept the scene, or who have called me an ableist, but there are people like Franz and Latex who I once looked up to and considered a sister, respectively, who have taken their stances towards me too far, whilst behaving in a contradictory manner concerning others, for me to remain compassionate towards them. I doubt either of them will even watch this video in its entirety, let alone have any response to my criticism of their behaviour, their views, if you will. I hope one day to see their actions match their words. The concept that any human being who is ever engaged in socially unacceptable humour is to be immediately discarded will not heal our environment, because it has only created fear, paranoia, and misery due to the fact that everyone has engaged with it. While another performer could be brought in at the drop of a hat, the human being underneath is not replaceable. You can edit me out of videos or delete me off your YouTube channel, but I still exist. And as time goes on, I continue to get message after message of apology or kindness from former friends, colleagues, or scene acquaintances who all felt pressured into publicly denouncing me in June. I feel conflicted because part of me does want to tell these people to fuck off. The betrayal is sometimes too hard to swallow, and how easily I was cast away by these people who I know had no issue until they were told to. But part of me knows I'm in no position to withhold forgiveness from anyone. It is a very complicated feeling to be told that I didn't deserve this to happen to me by people who helped inflict it. And I think everyone is dealing with some level of guilt about what transpired. One common thread is that every person who gets back in contact with me feared being next, or somehow implicated. And in particular, they feared being on the receiving end of the same level of vitriol and harassment that I was in particular. As we all know, these screenshots originated from private group chats, so let's address that yes, my trust was broken, and that can happen to anyone. And that I had to process that on top of what was happening to me online. Nobody is perfect. We have all done and said things in private which we would be unwilling or unable to defend publicly, let alone what comments could be taken out of context with malicious presentation. I have had the worst thing that I've ever said in my life that I desperately wish I could take back, not because I've been caught, but because of how much damage it has done to innocent bystanders who were never meant to see it, let alone be hurt by it, be publicly broadcast to hundreds of thousands of people. If you're going to tell me that you have never said anything in your entire life which could possibly be presented as hurtful, cruel, or wrong, then I don't believe you. So much more of it, though, was deliberately misrepresented. And how do you defend yourself from lies while still remaining accountable to the truth, to an audience that will deny whatever you have to say? I know that everybody is guilty because I have been told that time and time again. And I have witnessed it firsthand, time and time again. And because other performers have and will continue to get exposed time and time again. Plenty of performers felt comfortable engaging in offensive humour, including Shigo in front of me, resolute in the understanding that I wasn't going to go to Twitter and cancel them. I know that everyone is guilty because Yanis's channel has lost dozens of videos year after year as more performers grew terrified of befalling the fate which I've now endured, for actions that they partook in publicly. Blaze said, if you're lucky to have a career which spans longer than 5 years, you'll inevitably exist across a change in socially acceptable conduct, and I couldn't agree with this more. Every interpersonal decision now in drag is being made with the constant overhanging dread and threat of, it may be okay now, but will it be okay later? Will this be used against me or taken out of context? Even in the week between Stephanie and I's cancellations, everyone was joking about filming each other and cutting people's words up. How is that normal or healthy? What I want to know is, how does anyone trust each other again after this? I'm sorry, but I just don't think the scene has become a better, safer or brighter place for what has transpired. Actually, I think it's more broken than it has ever been. I've received so many messages from previously loyal and frequent audience members who now don't want to touch drag with a 10-foot pole, not because of the offensive comedy, but because how disgusting the online vitriol was towards myself and others. The fact of the matter is, an overwhelming amount of non-disabled people have taken umbrage with me specifically for what is, in reality, the way I discussed my own autistic relationship and love life in private with my friends, and that feels insurmountable to unpick. The general feeling I understand by speaking to Papa and other disabled people in the scene is that ableism has been used as a weapon by those unaffected by it. The voices which matter in this conversation are the voices which experience ableism, not opportunistic queens who are happy for the personal gain at the expense of another. I am a voice which experiences ableism, and I am done letting myself be misrepresented. Has a single disabled artist, other than Freddie Ossity, been hired as a resident at any mainstream drag show? When now more than ever would be the time to empower disabled artists with positions of leadership? Has any accessibility consultation organisation, such as Birds of Paradise, which I know my ex-partner has sent to numerous events operators, actually been contacted or consulted? Has there been any baseline measures taken to ensure digital accessibility with alt text, image descriptions and closed captioning? Be honest with yourself, has there been any meaningful attempt to change the way that an ableist environment operates? Especially by those who built their platform in my absence by citing themselves as an unproblematic alternative, only to later be revealed to have behaved the exact same way. From an outsider's perspective, it just looks like the names on the bills changed, and that's all. Honestly, I've never felt so disconnected from my own community, both queer and neurodivergent. In particular, trying to navigate my own autism with very few voices to turn to has been especially challenging. And especially to be turned into a symbol of bigotry towards a community which I belong to which hurt was never my intention, and to which any assertion that I have hurt either requires misrepresenting my words or blaming me for other people's behaviour. It's incredibly upsetting. Recently, I had a conversation with Poison, who asserted that my previous stories, which brought to light both Shigo Sinner's false public concern for diversity as mere virtue signalling, and Callum Raymond Young's actually bigoted insinuations concerning ambulatory wheelchair users, were a proof of my lack of growth and just trying to get back at people. If you have made it this far into the video, I would hope that you could see that that is not true at all. I don't care about getting back at anyone, I care about moral consistency. Need I remind you, in June, I was asked numerous times by numerous key voices to turn out my group chats and to implicate everyone else who was involved or complicit with offensive humour or ignorant ideals, and I have simply done what I was asked to do. I outlined my reasons for ending my silence. I had hit my limit of frustration with scapegoating, the hypocrisy of Candy Walls, as she was harassing a child online at the time, and the fact that Callum had promised not to book Shigo as my replacement and had chose to anyway. I've made all of this clear, publicly, and whatever conclusions you come to about me severing my loyalty to Callum after months of lies and cruel treatment from him towards me are entirely your own. Frankly, there is more I could reveal on lots of people, and everyone knows that. You're all just frustrated that I didn't implicate the people that you wanted an excuse to attack. We all saw Eden Spaghetti's salivating an attempt to pin my behaviour on Slutdrop Sally, which now looks awfully cruel when you take into consideration how supportive Eden has remained of Lilith. I remain confused why I ended up on a petition about my power in the scene, when firstly, Shigo remains relatively unmolested, despite admitting to the usage of ableist slurs directed at someone and platforming an admitted sexual predator for years. And she continues to perform with Girls in Glasgow's biggest gay bar, and the author of the petition attempted to join that cast. Secondly, Callum, in particular, who gave me the power that you all felt I needed taken away from me, has been completely unaffected by this, to the extent where he has not put out any kind of public statement whatsoever to clarify his private ableist conduct, simply blocked and deleted comments repeatedly, and started advertising the venue as inclusive to dogs rather than disabled people. Callum and his entourage applied so much pressure to myself and Stephanie to speak up when we were in the hot seat. But what would the response from the scene have been if I had stayed silent, business as usual, and simply deleted comments? Yet, Callum has been permitted to do so. Power is the ability to ignore the damage that you have done and carry on as if nothing has happened. Callum owns a venue, and as a former staff member, I can tell you he rakes in thousands of pounds a week. There are plenty now of non-drag performers who are happily making a buck in the Corset Club, completely unfettered by this complicity narrative which has taken over the scene. In reality, venue managers and owners hold the power that you erroneously believe showrunners to have. If I was as powerful as you were making me out to be, then that petition wouldn't have touched me. But that's a conversation for another day. The scene continues to fight over scraps and £50 bar bookings, while a man like Callum walks away with thousands in his pocket, as it always has. What needs to be made clear is that I stepped away of my own accord from the gay scene. That decision was not made for me, and after experiencing the suffocating hypocrisy, I do not have much desire to return to it. As an aside, Poison also advertises the fact that she is a fan of South Park in her Tinder bio, so you'll forgive me if I don't believe the authenticity of her disappointment in me as a person for engaging with offensive humour. I told Papa that I was going to make this video, and he told me that he did not know how it would go over, and I do agree with that. I suppose I'm expecting that this video will be torn apart. Firstly, I do expect to be told that I'm showing a lack of growth, which I think is fairly clearly not the case. And further, I don't feel like anyone could even hold an informed opinion on if they've made no effort to involve themselves with me interpersonally since June, or frankly from over a year ago when these screenshots are actually from. Let's address that. While you all became aware of these screenshots in June, it's fairly obvious that they're not from June, as evidenced by the near unanimous assertions of the transformation that I underwent between August 2023 and June 2024, not even just from those in my personal life, but even when I worked with Demi Point and Tina Justina at Fempire, both of them made comments either to me or to other members of staff about how much happier, lighter and better I appeared to be doing. I don't believe that I am the person now that I was during the Fringe of last year, one of the most stressful and emotionally challenging months of my life. I am honestly a very deeply mentally unwell person who just so happens to excel at the art form of drag. And April-May 2024 is probably the more clear-headed and lucid I've ever been in my life. I expect there to be comments about this video being too long, or self-indulgent drivel, because I absolutely am over-explaining myself, which is actually a common autistic trait, but I think that attacking someone for attempting to provide thorough context, explanation and rationale is cheap and lazy arguing, and some of these points bear repeating. If you see the timestamp of this video and decide it's too much of me speaking for you to stomach, that is your prerogative. But I have chosen every sentence and every point that I made in this video with intention. I have rewritten this script over and over again. Everything here serves a purpose. Take it as you will. The pain of the belief that if you are just to explain yourself right, to word things the perfect way, then you'll finally be understood by those dedicated to misunderstanding you is one of the most common autistic social traumas. To level with you all, I think when anybody is asked to explain innumerable accusations of various types, it would be fair for any person to create a lengthy script, let alone somebody who struggles with over-explaining themselves. Maybe once again, I'll be accused of putting a script through ChatGPT, as speaking atypically or robotically is a common autistic trait. This accusation is beyond disgusting and is ableist in itself. I've actually been criticised for the way I communicate my entire life and always been presented as rude or inconsiderate due to differences in communication style, or been attacked for not knowing things that I just wasn't told directly. An early argument that I remember having as a baby queen was with Kiko, who told me to just speak fucking normally and to stop being so condescending and talking like a robot when we were having a discussion about my constant over-apologising. I used to say to her, "You were so amazing tonight, sorry if I annoyed you by pulling you for a photo." I always thought that if I removed all the emotions and argued purely from a logical perspective, then I'd be understood, which I have found just makes people angrier. These comments did stick with me though, as how aggressively frustrated she was by insecurity, and then my attempt to validate that perspective and step outside of the situation to fully discuss the issue was so wholeheartedly made out into being a bad thing. It's hard to take any of that as anything other than a mixture of projection and a commitment to being annoyed with me, no matter what I do or say, so that everyone has a Skinny did this to me story to hate bond over, which is something I'll unpack another time. When I didn't wave at you when I went to the bathroom, or if I didn't want you sitting at my fully booked table, I warned you about weeks in advance, or when I left the room when you performed one time, or whatever it is. This essay is so long and complicated and personal, I don't know how it could possibly make the case that I used ChatGPT, and for the record, my original apology obviously wasn't either. I also wasn't any of the burner accounts, and I don't know why it's so unthinkable to all of you that people wanted to defend me. I am not scared of you. I was just in the throes of a harassment campaign. I was always going to speak when, or more so if, I ever got my voice back. I am acutely aware that there has been a huge undercurrent of negativity towards me. Kiko literally tweeted that everyone has hated me for years, and there is something to gain socially by being part of the Skinny Mini hate club. So actions which have always been relatively benign are taken great offence to, but certainly never actually communicated to me in the moment or even afterwards as an issue. To be honest, I did start to find this quite funny and play into it in recent years as the histrionic panto villain of I saw Goody Proctor with the devil of the most innocuous actions of mine were just far too camp to take seriously. I know this to be true of how the scene operates because when I came into the scene, there were different targets who everyone hate bonded over their negative experiences with, which is now 180'd and those people are fairly universally loved. There is always someone who is being targeted openly, but yet everyone engages in doublethink and deludes themselves into thinking that line of thought has been suppressed by the scene or is not allowed. No, I am well aware of what you were all saying about me, and there were very few spaces in the scene where negativity about me wasn't encouraged. In fact, it's very common in the scene, historically, to befriend someone simply for disliking the same people, rather than having anything of note in common, and literal group chats exist for the sole purpose of hate stalking certain individuals and their every move. I know that because I have been in one before, and because performers still come to me now to tell me about the ones they're in that revolve around me. Perhaps what I expect the most is that I am going to get made out to be manipulative, using the facts of the situation for sympathy, and have my intentions dissected rather than any of the points that I've made engage with, for reasons that I truly cannot understand, as I continually lay out my honest intentions and rationale as clearly as I possibly can, and have even posted screenshots which equally incriminate myself as much as others, plain for all to see. I have not villainized you by pointing out inconsistencies in your logic, or illuminating contradictory behaviour. If I was a master manipulator, then I would not be in this situation. I'm not interested in debating intentions anymore, as you've all outlined pretty clearly that my benign intent does not negate negative impacts in my crimes. So I hold you all to that being equally irrelevant now. Let's talk about the material reality of the scene and the actions which could be taken to bettering it. I suppose the reality that I have to contend with is that for many, the solution or response once a wrongdoing is confronted or challenged is that the perpetrator should merely stop existing. That you must lock yourself in a dark room and never interact with any other human being ever again. And this is applied regardless of the severity of the crime. Any attempt to clarify the situation for whatever purpose is defensiveness, or a lack of accountability. Any apology you make is false and just damage control. You cannot do right for doing wrong. This is, of course, completely unrealistic and a subhuman punishment when you consider the actual nature of the crime. But thankfully, for those who want an excuse to join a mob, when someone becomes a sanctioned target, it becomes permitted to behave in a manner of abject cruelty towards them without any self-reflection. I don't generally consider myself to be interpersonally, socially unaware, but I do hope that this video has articulated that much of what's been thrown at me on the topic of ableism specifically is just unfair to hold someone accountable for. Not just for an autistic person, but anyone. I am not a mind reader. I do not know that you are dissatisfied with me if you do not communicate that you are dissatisfied with me. I will never just know that, as I made the conscious choice to turn off my own paranoid overthinking after many years of therapy. I worked myself to a belief of, if somebody has an issue, then they will tell me. But if they don't say anything, then it can't be that big of a deal. And that's the metric that I hold myself to. But alas, this is a social rule that, while I've adopted, it's not one the drag scene remotely adheres to. I've learned the drag scene is its own beast of social norms and customs, quite unlike any other environment on earth, because it is a disgusting recipe of communication issues, trauma, insecurity, financial competition, and alcohol. The reality is that you do, unfortunately, need to communicate your feelings and frustrations in order to be heard and understood. I am frankly only human, and I am presently incredibly publicly vulnerable. I have outlined myself both during and before this as entirely open to dialogue and conversation. Adjacently, I do not feel it's worthwhile to go fully into the statement posted regarding the seats that I had booked at the Suck You Cycle 1 finale, but seeing as my ex-partner already clarified much of the completely false presentation of the situation. But for the purposes of comprehensiveness, I will touch on that. I'm unsure how else I could have been expected to handle the situation besides how I did. I booked a table every week for myself, my ex-partner, and the Suck photographer. The final fourth seat was usually up for grabs to one of my friends. I wasn't particularly friends with the person who made this statement, and I let him sit with me numerous times in a row at a mostly full table despite that. And I let him know in advance that my finale table was going to be full. I outlined how they could book their own table so their access needs would remain fulfilled, and I was direct, communicative, and clear. On the night of the finale, this person floated around my table, pouting about not having a seat. I ultimately then did let this person sit with me, and I expressed that I was frustrated as I had given them ample warning that I would be unable to accommodate them at the finale, and I'm putting aside the fact that accommodating them is not my responsibility as a 19-year-old fellow paying customer, and I was upset that my plans to sit with my ex-partner were being disrupted. I wasn't rude, aggressive, or nasty to this person. I said my piece and moved on, and this isn't really a social interaction that I've dedicated much thought to because it happened over half a decade ago, until it was brought up again in June, as evidence of how awful a person I am. Personally, I don't think I owe this person an apology at all. I actually think some responsibility could be taken on his own part, considering that I did give him a clear outline of self-empowerment for his own access needs, which he refused to act upon when he was entirely capable of doing so. As he said in his statement, 2 of his close friends were competing, and it's not like they didn't have tables of friends and family that he could sit with. We were not close, and I did not hold a monopoly over the only free chair in the room. There were plenty of other places he could go or people he could sit with, but he simply insisted on sitting with me at my table every week, and that never made any sense to me. This person never raised an issue to me or spoke to me afterwards about how they felt about this ever. Of everything that happened in June this year, that statement felt the most personal, insincere, and weaponized. What's interesting to me, reflecting upon myself back then, when I would attend the same show every week consistently, 2 hours early without fail, in the same outfit head to toe, sitting in exactly the same seat and absolutely requiring my ex-partner's attendance in order to be able to socially relax. Why did absolutely no one, including myself, ever read those behaviours as potentially autistic, or the fact that I would have complete panic attacks, crying or lashing out when my routine was unexpectedly changed, or my access needs weren't met, as an autistic meltdown? Note that I've always understood all of these things to be my own responsibility to carry out for my own comfort, and I've always tried my best to respond with emotional tact when access needs clash. Any of you who know me personally can attest to how huge moving on from the banana ball cap was for me, and how distressed I would become if I ever misplaced it or if it got damaged. I would literally rather miss a show than attend a show without wearing it. It almost is this weird feeling of grief as I retread all these past experiences and social interactions and my own idiosyncrasies, even beyond drag, through that lens. Do you know that I've bought the same eyeshadow palette 6 times since lockdown lifted? Because I just cannot use anything else. Or that I only eat 2 or 3 safe meals on rotation every single day, which I always thought was due to struggling with an eating disorder growing up, but now I just don't know. But of course, there are people like Scout, who have barely given me the time of day interpersonally in the last 6 years, who feel entitled to air publicly their belief that I'm lying about this for, what, clout? A lighter sentence? For Scout to publicly discredit self-diagnosis, which in itself is ableist and classist to do, when I do in fact have a diagnosis, as if that is even necessary, just speaks to how little they know about me or what they are talking about. Frankly, yes, it's likely that someone who acted in a socially unacceptable, blunt or off-putting way in an environment full of queer and neurodivergent people is neurodivergent. I've never understood my constant social issues until looking at myself through this lens, and my personal, lifelong journey of being myself is of far greater importance to me than the understanding or approval of those who have been committed to picking me apart since I was a teenager. I'll put aside that accusing neurodivergent people of faking their experiences for cheap sympathy is one of the most typical ableist microaggressions, because I just do not care what you believe. I know my reality. It's almost like this group of people who allegedly uplift disabled people actually completely stigmatise any neurodivergent behaviour which doesn't fit into their very narrow worldview of quirky, relatable, wall of plushies fantasies. We are not all easily infantilised, golden retriever energy or manic pixie dream girls. Whether it is cluster B personality disorders, or autism, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder, a lot of symptoms of mental health issues are not pretty or sympathetic. Autistic people can be read as rude, often completely unintentionally. I am known to be very blunt, but I do not like the phrase brutally honest, because I've never set out to be brutal, just direct, and I think neurotypical people use this phrasing as an excuse to be mean. When I started drag, people would pick apart my makeup and outfits, and then say to me, well, I'm just being brutally honest with you, with unsolicited feedback. I've always been very blunt and direct throughout this entire video, especially in regards to Shigo and Eden, but I am not being brutal. I am not being cruel. I am being direct with my presentation of information and thoughts that I have on it. I literally don't know how else to be, because I've never been anything else. The truth is, it's easy to empathise with someone who's sad, but it's not easy to empathise with someone who's angry. There are so much respect and understanding extended towards being unable to articulate your feelings, colloquially described in the drag scene as going non-verbal. But if you have an uncontrollable outpouring of nonsensical emotion with no through line, then you are scary and unsafe. I've had several public autistic meltdowns on many different occasions. I think the Divas 4 Comedy Week is a particularly memorable one that many vocal figures in this saga actually coaxed me through at the time. A shutdown and a meltdown are two sides of the same coin of autism, whether it is to emotionally freeze or to emotionally lose control. If you know me, you'll know that in disagreements, I always try and take myself out of the situation and look past the emotion to address the argument and the misunderstanding. I take myself out of it to discuss it logically, like I did to Kiko years ago. As a more recent example, I was called unsupportive of someone, and my rebuttal to that was that I had offered them to borrow my drag, and they had. I understand now that that was their emotional reaction, feeling a certain way, which I was trying to counter with my logical action, acting a certain way, and that's why that conversation went nowhere. A lot of you will have seen me, over the years, let my friends get really angry and nasty to me over circumstances which aren't quite true, and that's because I understand, in many cases, they're not acting with complete control of themselves when emotionally overloaded. It's ironic that I've been made out to be intimidating, controlling, and creating a culture where there's no freedom of speech, because in my personal life, everyone has spent years encouraging me to stand up more for myself and not let others walk all over me. I know how I can be when I'm emotionally overloaded, so I try to hold as much grace for others as possible when they're in those circumstances. Yes, all adults are responsible for their own behaviour, but it's clear that there is a double standard in what is a permissible display of neurodivergence. As another example, I'd say stimming is generally understood within the scene, except when it comes from someone that isn't well liked or respected. Then they are loud, annoying, self-centred, and can be openly mocked on Twitter for always screeching in Delmonicas. I am sure you all know who I'm referring to, and they don't deserve the public humiliation of being named here, but we are all aware that Shigo, and Poison for that matter, ring-led a lot of that negativity. Even the fact that my earlier, entirely lucid and articulate posts concerning Callum were described as a deranged tantrum is an example of what I'm talking about, as if expressing emotion would negate the point I've made, or that I'm not entirely entitled to anger about being scapegoated for ableism by my former employer. I've always thought that redirecting the conversation towards someone's emotions rather than their argument is tone policing. No point that I made about Callum is less valid because I was upset when I said it. We could even take this line of argument further to discuss addiction, whether it be to drugs or alcohol, risky or impulsive behaviours, which does include saying things while fully aware that they're wrong for shock value, or consistently toxic interpersonal relationships, all of which are completely prominent in nightlife, queer culture, and neurodivergent communities. There is simply not the same compassion or understanding extended towards neurodiverse people with less glamorous or socially acceptable symptoms. In saying this, there is a prominent, long-standing member of the Scottish drag scene who struggles with addiction, and I've first-hand witnessed her be physically violent, verbally abusive, and engage with offensive and bigoted language when under the influence of alcohol, despite the fact that I've only met her a handful of times. But this person is very well liked, very well supported, and when these relapses happen, there is no judgment extended towards her. I am not judging her either. In fact, I feel bad even bringing her up, and I wouldn't unless she didn't perfectly articulate my point. And I want to be really clear that I don't hold that behaviour against her either, as I don't think a relative stranger accosting an addict for their actions mid-relapse would be constructive at all. The point is, my confusion lies in why other known addicts in the scene are not given the same grace when they relapse, which again reinforces my belief that the disabled people are treated with differing levels of compassion in the scene, depending on how well liked they are. That is why my ex-partner stopped attending shows. In this environment, any perceived social misdeed is fatal, unless you are one of the select few for whom it isn't, and he felt that his behaviour would reflect on me, as he was only ever seen as an extension of me. He became so stressed out about accidentally tarnishing my career by being unaware of some unspoken social rule, and giving someone ammunition who didn't like me. There are so many examples of this. Once, in a review, I said that I would have preferred a bigger wig proportionally on a certain queen, and I spent the next week being called a fatphobe by the drag scene. If you've ever wanted to know where Skinny Minnie is a fat shamer originated from, there you go, because accusations like that enter the general cultural conscience of the scene long after the initial offence is forgotten. This comment, obviously, is completely innocuous, and it's a frequent critique given interpersonally, competitively, and on Drag Race. It gets absolutely no reaction when it's said by someone that a performer isn't trying to pick a fight with. It's not fatphobia, proportions are mathematical. If someone wants to take you in bad faith, they will. My ex would spend so many nights, especially after Trigger, because they were the worst for this, terrified and ruminating that he had said something which would be twisted against us, or if some sort of autistic overwhelm happened, that we would be judged, either by how he behaved or how I handled it. I also suffered with the same rumination, and many times I had to have him attend shows with me as almost a buddy system to check if I had ever said something potentially wrong that I would need to be concerned about. I didn't even drink until after the pandemic due to my extreme, heightened anxiety of doing or saying something wrong due to a relaxed social filter which would then be weaponised against me. I now wish that I'd never started drinking, and I understand my behaviour back then to have been masking. I actually even used to keep a notes app documenting every conversation that I'd had to reference when I would be pulled into rumination, and especially about who had said what about who, as I desperately tried to keep track of who did and who didn't like each other. I was very, very mentally unwell at the time, and the Scottish drag scene has only made it worse. I'd say it's a fairly inarguable position at this point that the Scottish drag scene has become known for its falseness, unspoken social rules, and constant mind games. I go as far to say that they also consistently twist people's words and actions far beyond reasonably good faith. Consider once again the invoking of Godwin's law when Eden accused Rajazel of Nazism, when there were several much simpler and more reasonable explanations. These environments are simply not formulated or gravitated towards by neurodivergent people, especially autistic people, who typically struggle with comprehending those complex unspoken dynamics, and as evidenced by those such as my ex-partner, who stopped attending shows for that exact reason, and myself, who nearly broke mentally trying to navigate it. If you knew me during the pandemic when it was all at its worst, then you'll know how difficult this was for me, and I worked very hard post-pandemic to free myself from that environment and create my own space. I believe that those environments in the scene are ableist because of how they set up to humiliate, isolate, and lock out neurodivergent people who do not fit a certain mould. In these environments, I feel underhanded and manipulative behaviour is rewarded, and direct confrontation is discouraged unless it has the singular purpose of attacking your enemy. Eden could dunk on Mujazo for likes and manipulatively make her out to be a Nazi, even though Eden and everyone else that engaged with that would be fully aware that it has no basis in truth. If Eden was genuinely concerned about a prolific queen and costume designer knowingly or unknowingly promoting Nazi imagery, then she would have reached out directly with her concerns, not shaded Rajazel on her close friend story. This embargo on communication in certain spaces, I think, has led directly to how terrified the scene is now, as consequences for social wrongdoing had never been more severe or apparent. We all know now more than ever that anything can be screenshotted, recorded, or slapped in a note app to be taken as the gospel, and that dialogue is just not an option. This makes the scene rife for miscommunication, and misunderstanding, which is an even more difficult sentence for the autistic people in our community. Ultimately, what is often referred to as bitchy drag queen drama is in many ways minimising harm towards neurodivergent people. I feel the need to make the following abundantly clear. To be consistently unkind or lie about someone behind their back while smiling in their face, especially pretending to be their friend, and assuring them that nothing is wrong between you, is gaslighting, if not bullying. It is also a very common autistic social trauma to think that somebody is your friend, but they're actually keeping you around just to milk you for laughs, and they don't have any real love or care for you. And we have all seen people in the scene do that. It is unethical, and it is ableist. As an example, I remember a brief situation where somebody put up a picture of Sissy Scorpio's poor makeup on their close friend story, which Sissy was not on, with the caption, "Prison, honey." And Sissy was very rightfully hurt by that, as she was being made fun of in a space that she didn't have access to by someone that she thought was her friend. We all know that drag queens' close friend stories are full of bitchy reads and takedowns of other people, only for the next story to be those same two people smiling in a club photo. And that is an inhospitable environment to be autistic in. We will never progress as a community on the subject of ableism if we don't stop doing this. Further, if Sissy decided to confront that person, she would not be bullying them. That is called standing up for yourself. You cannot be unkind about someone behind their back and then cry crocodile tears when you're asked to explain that behaviour to your face. You all want to be cruel without consequence, and be cruel without even admitting to yourselves that you are being cruel. Simply because you don't like someone, or because they have done something wrong, does not give you the permission to mistreat them, or negate their right to have an issue with that behaviour. Conflict is not abuse, and presentation of it as such leads to ableist narratives about neurodivergent people who do not present with conflict avoidance symptoms. I'd say, in my view, describing an autistic person as evil or cruel because their communication style of conflict resolution is direct, which is something you're uncomfortable with, is ableism. Can somebody please explain to me why directly raising an issue or attempting to work towards a solution or apology in the wake of upset or wrongdoing is a social misdeed? Why have I always been made to feel like I am supposed to just pretend it didn't happen when someone has been unkind about me or lied about me? And why is me trying to clarify that with them a bad thing? Why is it that I'm expected to belittle and disregard my own feelings and autonomy for the sake of the comfort of others, especially others who haven't been kind about me? This is the don't rock the boat mentality. Keep the peace. Pretend you're not being hurt by what's being said. But I am hurt, and I'm allowed to be. I've always struggled with the fact that as soon as I've heard or seen evidence of unkind behaviour happening behind my back, I physically cannot be in a room with that person without either thinking about it, nor can I speak to them without bringing it up. This is why I need to take space from people if they have hurt me, but are unable to have an adult conversation about what's happened. I was far more sensitive emotionally when I entered the drag scene, and in later years I approached this more on principle than necessity. But it's like when I would see someone who had been cruel about me, all that I could see was whatever they'd said flashing in neon letters above their head. I would never be outwardly unkind about their behaviour at the onset of confrontation, but I would simply be unable to continue in their presence without addressing it. While yes, many neurodivergent people are vulnerable in situations of confrontation, which I respect, and is why I would never, and have never, forced anyone to sit through a conversation that they are unwilling to have. Of course, there are instances where the other party has become upset, at which point I have stopped the conversation. Because confrontation is uncomfortable for most, and unfortunately, this is an inevitability. It's also uncomfortable for me to have to advocate for myself. And I do feel often that the other party's discomfort comes at the fact that they are being confronted and having a mirror held up to them of their own actions, rather than anything I am doing in particular. Equally, there are neurodivergent people such as myself who are very confrontational and direct with their thoughts, and to categorise this as dangerous, wrong, or abusive, firstly allows bullying to go unchecked, and secondly stigmatises neurodivergent behaviour. No one should ever be denied the opportunity to seek clarification on actions which have been taken towards them. Talk shit, get hit, fuck around and find out. The scene-wide embargo on communication of being fear as branded a bully or drama further extends to all questionable behaviours which go unchecked as a result of that unspoken social rule. This is very confusing to take in tandem with Shigo's assertion that this wrongdoing needs to be called out at the time, because when I have done that, I am called a bully. If Sissy wanted to confront this person, or even end their false friendship as a result, she would be entirely unjustified to do so. I'd even say that if Sissy was a showrunner and chose not to book that person, then she would also be justified. You cannot behave cruelly towards someone that you want financial opportunities from, and then be shocked when your cruelty deprives them of their desire for a working relationship with you, or frankly deprives you of their desire to share space with you in general. A venue hiring someone to produce entertainment does not make them a public servant, or a human being incapable of being hurt by another human being, and certainly not permitted to enforce a boundary of distance between them. The language of person with power presents firstly all events producers on the same level of influence, which is untrue. There is a significant difference between Demi Point, who is Church's venue manager, and Tina Justina, who won a handful of slots at Three Sisters. And secondly, this acts as though any given producer is now a public servant, betrothed to the wants of the community, which doesn't account for the liquid nature of show business. Somebody's status as a showrunner can change overnight. If someone is cruel to or about Demi, she does not have to overlook that out of duty to the community, aka this specific person, when choosing who to book for a bar gig. That slot is a privilege, not something that anyone is entitled to, and the sooner that this is understood, the sooner the scene will be able to emotionally mature. People in the scene who engage with this false and cruel behaviour often cite the idiom of, "we are colleagues, not friends," as if that negates the unkind and two-faced treatment of another human being. The reality is these people do not see each other as colleagues, because colleagues have a baseline respect for each other as they work towards a shared goal. These people see each other as competitors, while hiding behind a thin veneer of paper-thin friendship, and are poised to turn on you at the slightest provocation. Shigo is probably the biggest proponent of this narrative I've ever encountered in the scene, and I think that mindset just speaks to how cruelly she can behave without guilt. I'm only a competitor, and this is only a chess game, so it's all well and good to intimidate children into unfollowing me and spreading lies about me in a venue I helped open, because that definitely doesn't speak to who she is at all. It's just the way things are. The fact that those who I'd called friends for half a decade were forced to sever personal ties with me, not out of their own personal desire to do so, but simply out of social pressure, is completely out of order. I return to the baseline point that we are all human beings and we all make mistakes. I personally did not spend any time with or excessively work with people who I did not enjoy being around, because I value my energy and my authenticity. Yes, of course there were drags, who were more so colleagues to me than friends, such as Shigo, which is inevitable, but I would never have spent any time in private on my close friend's story, mocking or belittling her, only to smile in her face the next day, because I am not false. If I do not like you, then I will just not engage with you. Coexistence is beautiful, and in the freelance world of entertainment, you will generally choose to work more so with people that you like and trust when you have to travel or rely upon each other. In the real world, making fun of someone on your close friend's story is always a cruel thing to do, but in the drag scene, it's a socially acceptable way to behave. It's just reading, and you have to accept that it comes with the territory, and you're once again not allowed to be hurt by it because you cannot rock the boat. This happened to me several times as a baby queen, and I'm wondering if it's universal. X would approach me and tell me that Y was talking shit about me. My immediate response was to ask why they had said that, and Y would then ask me who told me that. I would say X, and Y would go away to get X. And suddenly, X and Y would return, and both be mad at me for stirring shit. It's been 6 years of attending drag shows, and I still don't understand what the proper social protocol is here, because suddenly everyone involved is angry at me, and I'm the bad guy. I'm the drama. I'm the TMZ of drag. Even though all I was trying to do was clear up negativity behind my back from someone who I thought was my friend. Who is in the wrong in this situation? Is there a bully and a victim, or is something more socially complicated afoot? The way I see it, I've broken an unspoken social rule, and it's one that I've been unable to recognise due to autism. What I think I was supposed to do, I understand, is talk shit with X about Y, and then when I see Y later, pretend I didn't do that. I, and I assume many other autistic people, cannot intuit that, nor would I consider myself to be particularly capable of it. I'm not immune, because of course I have clowned on people and close friends before. I am a drag queen. I have never said something though behind someone's back that I wouldn't be later willing to admit to their face or own up to if confronted about it. I am not scared of my own behaviour. Your horror stories of Skinny confronted me in the club neglect to include what behaviour of yours had led me to confront you. If you're going to call me a pig in a wig on your Twitter circles, then I'm going to hold up that tweet and oink at you. Why can you act, but I cannot react? Is that not victim blaming? You're all posturing on Twitter, call out bad behaviour, but you don't like it when it's done to you, because you don't want to admit that you engage in bad behaviour. And this scene-wide acceptance of regular cruelty is far more dangerous to neurodivergent people than me talking about having an autistic boyfriend in a private group chat. I understand being capable of confronting directly seems to have earned me a title as nasty, which I'm not disputing, but how is it more morally permissible to be critical of someone behind their back and false to their face than to be critical of someone behind their back and to their face also? Whenever I've criticised someone's actions, I've stood by what I've said, and in the event that I don't in the light of new information, then I'll apologise and retract it. I hold myself to that standard. In truth, before this, I didn't spend any time tearing apart other performers' looks or numbers because I actually genuinely don't care what other people are doing. I don't spend time focusing on people that I don't like or have only ever met a handful of times because I'm not looking to bring negativity into my life. As I said earlier, I'm confused by people like Eating Spaghetti who want to go on about how much they dislike me and want nothing to do with me, but then somehow know all of my regular working venues and are able to keep track of how many custom looks Gillian has made for me. There's nothing stopping you before all this from just blocking me and coexisting in peace if you hated me so much. Especially, as you said, you don't rely upon me financially, so you have no reason whatsoever to engage with me personally or professionally. As I said, outrage culture is fun. It's then always the people who engage in this behaviour the most behind closed doors who play victim when they're on the receiving end of a call out. Like Marla, who after dozens of tweets about how she's not a shite bag when there's a Twitter mob to embolden her, immediately went private and fled when the spotlight turned on her, and people want an explanation as to why she thought it was appropriate to give a challenge win to a performance of a comedy number appropriating mobility aids. You cannot present yourself as the nicest person ever when your private life is spent belittling and attacking other people. What you were saying on Twitter is how you have been talking about me privately for years. That is what you all said. You finally had an excuse to be cruel in broad daylight. Regardless of your opinion of me, I've never presented myself as anything other than honest, which is an adjective I'm proud of and one that you do not have any claim to. I take pride in the fact that you couldn't withstand a day of what I went through for months. I personally love to see the trigger group chat from the day that I won Majesty, because I'm sure it's all sunshine and rainbows. Yes, Bearbury calling me a rat bastard publicly on Twitter, unprovoked, immediately after I won Majesty, which was a choice I had no say in, is bullying. And if that's what she was willing to say in front of everyone, then I'd love to know what she was saying in private. I also know that there's a group chat of Eden performers, which at least 4 separate people have left and come to me since its creation because it was so negative, toxic, and constantly bitching about everyone. Franz is in both of those chats, by the way, and I'm sure she's just a helpless bystander to all that cruelty, and it certainly wouldn't reflect upon her views. These are the same people who consider themselves victims of bullying, despite the fact that I haven't shared oxygen with them more than once since 2021, and they seem unable to consider that they're perpetuating the exact same behaviour themselves, only to targets that they've deemed as acceptable, and likely because they see bullying as something only the powerful can do to the powerless, and what they're doing is justified critique. Justified critique is not posting memes of the job centre. That's cruelty, and is actually classist because it presents employment aids as shameful. Justified criticism, actually, would be asking Franz to her face why she asked for a booking, accepted and confirmed the booking, then slept through it, didn't attend, and left the event without an entertainer, and turned up to Dells like nothing had happened, after ignoring all messages for the course of several days, asking what had happened. That is a justified criticism of her lack of professionalism. But don't rock the boat. This also relies upon the belief that Trigger is bereft of power, which is demonstrably false. Significant amounts of problematic behaviour were either covered up or permitted because nobody wanted to go against Carrie Ann's decree, and they have now returned to light. Additionally, as one of the few people who actually did take issue with Kiko's cultural appropriation pre-pandemic, I am well aware of how shouted down and socially ostracised anyone was made to feel for feeling that way. In 2019, when there were only 2 shows in Glasgow, it was very intimidating to have to disagree with Carrie Ann, because it did feel as though 50% of all opportunities were hanging over your head, and the other 50% of opportunities through Rajazzle were already spoken for. That was something that I worked very hard to dismantle when I became friends with her, something Chucky is evidence of and could attest to. And why I always advocated for uplifting new and fresh talent, which is demonstrable through my own past choices as a producer. Autism and neurodivergency are infinitely complicated, and while there are many incredible parts to being autistic, it is certainly not easy. If the scene wants to work towards unlearning and dismantling foundational ableism, then a lot of work has to actually be done in changing the ways that we behave towards each other. There will need to be actual education done about how neurodivergence can present, and all disabilities, whether physical, mental or social, which is only the start, because compassion and understanding will need to be extended towards everyone, including those that you don't like, who are not perfect victims, and who have behaved in a manner which is socially unacceptable. While neurodivergence is never an excuse, it is an explanation for many of the issues in the Scottish drag scene, and we as a community need to learn to embrace that. A space is only as safe as those who inhabit it. We are our society. You are not anti-ableist if you mock loud, stimming teenagers and Delmonicas. The shady, nasty put-downs on close friends or Twitter need to stop. I would usually say keep it for the group chat, but maybe not that either. It's not all about old performances or edgy language. We all know these are just snappy gotchas, which frankly avoid discussion of the deeper issues, which is what disabled activists have been saying since before this all began. It's about the general attitude towards disabled people. As I mentioned before, those who position access needs as a non-priority, or those who do not conform to the social norm are treated. And while the drag scene does skew towards the neurodivergent, there is certainly still a social norm enforced, and some unacceptable ways to behave as a neurodivergent person, not to mention other disabilities, such as being a wheelchair user, an addict, or hard of hearing. No individual, environment, or community could heal or thrive when the punishment for any social wrongdoing is complete humiliation, exclusion, and redaction. when unintentional social wrongdoing is a symptom of most neurodivergencies. Autism is literally a social disability. I have seen so many autistic performers and audience members freak out when they think that they've been misinterpreted or made an accidental social faux pas and it's going to ruin everything for them, because all it takes is one person who does. And now look at this massive script that I've got to put together to discuss misrepresentations of myself for talking about my autistic boyfriend. Neurodivergency is messy, trauma is messy, nightlife is fucking messy, and categorizing impulsive, ignorant, or deliberately edgy behaviour as bigoted values stalls the conversation of activism, because we are all switched on enough to know what actually has to change. My heart goes out to the young, neurodivergent performers who are currently growing up in the scene with a most inhospitable and false environment to make mistakes in. Queer nightlife is scary at the best of times, and I, for one, am glad to be healing far, far away from it. As a final note, I've chosen not really to address my mental health crisis in any substantial form throughout this video, because I'm still processing what happened and what I put my family and friends through, and specifically how the wider community chose to react to it. What I am willing to say is the way that Stephanie Banks was treated in the immediate aftermath of my mental health crisis, when I was her best friend and support system to the ongoing awful circumstances she was experiencing, was despicable. Stephanie is and has always been openly neurodivergent, and was in a truly horrific headspace as she was in the thick of ongoing humiliation and trauma herself. That being said, nothing she did or said concerning me was wrong. What transpired in the aftermath of that crisis was the worst misrepresentation of them all, and by far the worst day of my entire life, and the most abject display of cruelty from the Scottish drag scene I've ever seen. She is allowed to hope something as awful as what I was pushed to could have opened a discussion about mental health, and that was the only hopeful thing that could come from something so awful, because it is literally what I am now doing with this video. She is allowed to speak about what was happening bluntly, because she had gone numb. Most importantly, how is policing a neurodivergent person behaving in a private group chat with their friends of 10 plus years in the immediate aftermath of the extreme public humiliation to tens of thousands of people anything other than absurd? How the fuck do you think you'd be speaking if you were in Stephanie's position? I've had years of therapy for trauma before all of this, and even more since. And yes, I want them to hurt as much as they hurt me is a completely normal thought to have. Yes, considering running away and faking your death is a completely normal thought to have. Categorizing those thoughts as evil is ableism. Do you not comprehend the sheer state of mania, delirium, and dissociation that Stephanie and I, two already traumatized, mentally unwell people, would have been going through? If you are a traumatized or abused person, have you genuinely never had those thoughts before? Parts of those conversations happened in May and were misrepresented to have taken place on the weekend of June 8th. I was not in any of those chats and was not aware of how Stephanie chose to cope or explain the situation to her childhood friends, and I don't think it's fair for anyone to pass judgment on that. As the person who was supporting her privately the week between our cancellations, Stephanie was at her most vulnerable, unstable, and I was worried that she was going to end her life. And I genuinely believe that policing how she acted is ableism. You cannot expect anyone, let alone someone with pre-existing trauma and a neurodivergence, to be behaving with a sound and rational mind in those circumstances. The decision to inform Twitter of what had happened with me had been made with my permission, so please hold any concern for your privacy. If my privacy was a concern of yours, then you would have been opposed to the leaking of my personal group chats. This decision was made to publicise what I was going through, because I was still receiving violent and aggressive messages even after I got home, which was why I wasn't allowed to use my phone. The scene wanted to believe the false narrative that was spun, and I knew deep down when I got home that you would all do this. You all sincerely need to unpack why you are so fucking twisted, why there is so much celebration in the streets when there was an inkling of doubt of my circumstances, and why so much vitriol continued to pour out of your mouths after learning you'd almost killed someone, only for it to increase tenfold at the slightest shadow of a doubt of its veracity. This is the cruelty without admission to cruelty I am talking about, and why the Scottish drag scene is genuinely a fucking cesspit. I'm not ready to discuss any of my feelings on that matter in any more depth beyond what I've just said, so please respect that. I'm also aware that I'm not the only person who was affected by the events of this summer who made an attempt on their own life, so maybe consider the negative implications that your actions will have had on those whose mental health crises were not published. This video has been a real project, and to those of you who watched it in its entirety, I'm very grateful and appreciative. And I hope some of the information that I presented could be of use to you. And I hope the scene can move forward with a little bit more moral consistency, and maybe a deeper understanding of the context of my behaviour as it pertains to ableism. This video now exists as a reference point to direct people towards when this allegation arises, as I'm sure it will continue to. And I sincerely hope it's sufficiently thorough in articulating my views. God knows I will have more to say in the future, but for now, take care everyone and treat people with authenticity.